Hello and welcome to this little commentary on argumentative essay openers. We're talking about introduction paragraphs for the type of essays that you are currently writing with paper 2, the argumentative essay. The main issue that I want to address in this commentary is what I like to refer to as since the dawn of time type of openers, which has never been a good way to start an argumentative essay, and very few other kinds of essays for that matter, except for those very extremely rare occasions when it is, because there are exceptions to every rule, and at the end of the day, writing is not a mechanized algorithm. And so what I'm talking about here, even though I have seen these exact 5 words start many an essay, it's a catch-all way of referring to overly broad type of opening lines. You see this especially with the hook, that is the first sentence of the essay, that's meant to be kind of an attention grabber. And there's often a tendency in student papers and other kinds of, I've seen this in professional writing as well. These overly broad statements, overly sweeping, all this kind of melodramatic, going for this sort of epic tone. But problems with it are many, right? So anything that starts off since the dawn of time, all throughout history, people everywhere have always done this or that. It's always problematic for a few reasons. One of them is that it's a cliche, right? The fact that I am making a video commentary about this should signify to you that this is an issue that is noticed by writing teachers everywhere, on student papers everywhere, right? So it's a cliche, it's overly done to the point that it's almost laughable, and sometimes it's downright laughable. It's comedic, right? Because it's it's striving for this kind of powerful statement, but it's so cliched that it's comical, and also that epic kind of start usually outweighs what follows immediately after, giving it this kind of lopsided feel. The other problem with it, the bigger problem perhaps, is that it drops the reader into a hole right when you should be giving the reader a foothold to grab onto. Anything that starts off this vague, it's not giving us any clear boundaries of the conversation. It's just pointing out that these things exist. And we'll look at some examples here in a moment. But you want to start setting up specific boundaries of the conversation in which you're taking part right from that very first sentence. You want to start off really specific. Avoid these kind of vague, weird, absolute statements that don't actually start working towards the thesis. You want to be working towards that thesis from the very first sentence, so that you can have a nice, tight thesis paragraph, that sets up the conversation, sets up the topic, the specific topic, the scope of that topic. So an analogy that I like to think about to help explain this is, think about it if you were writing about a game. Think about it if you were writing about basketball. You wouldn't want your first sentence to be something like, all throughout human history, people have played sports. That doesn't get us any closer to anything. If you're talking about, if you're writing about basketball, then you want to start off talking about basketball. And you're probably, let's say that it was a 3 to 4 page paper, just for the illustrative purposes here. You're probably not talking about the whole history of basketball even, right? You're probably talking about a very specific era, perhaps even a very specific team. In which case you would state that team that you're talking about. Let's say you want to write about the Brooklyn Nets. You go right into talking about the Brooklyn Nets and the specific circumstances in which you are discussing them, right? So you'd probably, again, this is just for illustrative example. I know none of you are writing about sports. But you'd go right into talking about the Brooklyn Nets, and then probably the specific players that you're talking about, and then express a reason why, and then get to your thesis, which would be some kind of analysis of those players, of the team, of how you think what their chances are for winning the championship. something like that, right? You want to get right into it. The point of that example is you want to start off talking about all of sports throughout human history, making some kind of melodramatic, epic statement like that. You probably also wouldn't even want to start off making some kind of reference to throughout the history of basketball. You'd want to start talking about the specific season in question, the specific team in question, the specific players, and then bring in the discussion why you're talking about it. Let's say that the point is whether or not they have a chance of winning the championship against the LA Lakers, and then you would offer up your claim that yes, they do for this, that, the other reason. Right? Get right to the point. Get right into it. So let's look at some more concrete examples here. So these, if you've written these kind of openers, you would want to delete them, right? So these are pretty close to thesis, not thesis statements. These are pretty close to opening sentences that I've read on papers in the past. So these kind of all pertain to topics that other students in other 1010 classes have written. These aren't word for word by any means, but they almost might as well be. Because again, one of the big problems with these kind of things is how cliched they are. So these don't really pertain to topics that you guys are presently writing about, but they are pretty close to things that I've read on student papers before in 1010 classes. So for example, technology has evolved throughout all of history so that we could use it to better communicate in our society today. Right, so there's a lot of problems with that. Let's say that you're writing about social media. This is one of the specific problems with this type of sentence, is that it's making this assumption that throughout all of human history, every technological development has been working towards this goal of us today being able to communicate better. And that's simply erroneous for a number of reasons. One of those is that technology encompasses a lot more than the internet and social media, right? And not every kind of technology is meant to increase communication. So you're already getting into a tangle. The reader is falling into this hole when they should be getting something to grab onto to get the conversation moving. So here's another example. Throughout history, Americans have placed the founding fathers on an undeserved pedestal. Now this one is a little bit better. It's a little bit more precise because we know that we're at least located in America and we're talking about the founding fathers. But the big problem with this type of sentence is if you say throughout history, that implies that, you know, history did not start with America. History did not start with the Declaration of Independence. History has been going on for, you know, recorded history has arguably been going on since the cavemen, right? The Neanderthals, cave paintings and all that. So this gets you into that it's another hole, it's another trap, right? Because throughout most of history, throughout the vast majority of history, America wasn't even a thing. The founding fathers weren't a thing. So it's a slippery slope from there. But as I said, it's a little bit better than that first sentence because we at least know that we're talking about America and the founding fathers, even though it's a faulty construction. People everywhere have always enjoyed the benefits of nature. Here's another example. All right, this one is pretty rough. It's incredibly vague. So let's say if you're talking about climate change, this is the type of cliched since the dawn of time opener that might turn up on a paper about climate change. However, the problem is, let's say that that's the case, there's nothing in this sentence that is getting us anywhere closer to talking about climate change. It's making an insupportable statement. I'm sure there's people that don't care about nature at all and would rather live in a completely modernized, mechanized society as removed from nature as possible, completely sanitized. Or there's other people that might be aware of the benefits of nature but don't have a particular enjoyment for it, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things. It's just way too vague. There's nothing to hold on to. Here's another example. Everyone knows that American corporations have always valued profit over people. But what happens when people see the pain caused by corporations to other people? So this one isn't terrible, but there's a big problem here that's with that everyone knows. Again, it's insupportable. How can you back that up if you said something like everyone knows that American corporations have always valued profit over people, right? So that's a way that you could rework this into something decent as a solid opener. And there's nothing wrong with starting off with a question exactly. There's right and wrong ways to do that, but the big problem here is that everyone knows. First of all, whether or not you can even prove this, there's a lot of people that might disagree. Perhaps owners of the CEOs of certain corporations might take issue with this. We have a way of using corporations as this term to kind of refer to these evil business conglomerates, especially we're talking about corporate America. And I do this too. I make the same mistake, but corporation refers to a lot of different things. There's a lot of small businesses that are corporations. Local restaurants might be corporations. It's just a business model essentially. So you can have small corporations that have nothing to do with like Amazon and General Motors or whatever. There's all kinds of corporations. So this is starting a conversation, but it's logically amiss because it's making far too vast a statement that's insupportable. And if the very first statement of the paper is insupportable, then how is the reader supposed to have any faith in where it's going after that? All right, so here's some happy first sentences that are using the opening paragraph to set up the conversation and zero in on your particular angle. Like I said, you want to be starting towards that thesis right from the get-go. So using a statistic can be a good way to do this, such as in this example. According to a recent Pew Research Center data poll, about 70% of Americans currently use social media every day to share information, observe news, and interact socially. All right, so this could be used to replace that previous sentence. Technology has evolved throughout all of history so that we can use it to better communicate in our society today. These two openers could be on the same paper, but except this one is a lot more precise. It's giving us a foothold. It lets the reader know that the paper is going to be specifically about social media in the current modern age. Now, especially since this statistic is from 2019, so it's pretty close to now. The reader can probably guess that this paper is somehow concerned with the sheer numbers of people using social media, but also what they're using it for information, news, social interactions, right? Which we kind of know if we're talking about social media that this is what it's being used for, but it doesn't say anything about entertainment here or something like that, right? So we're probably talking about the political aspects on some level of social media, and we already know that this is the conversation that is happening, and that we're working towards a thesis that is somehow making an assertion about this sort of thing. Like I said, the politics and social media or something along those lines. Here's another one, and this one could replace the throughout history, Americans have placed the founding fathers on an undeserved pedestal example. This one could something like this might replace that. There is an often neglected but crucial distinction to be made between the concept of a memorial and that of a monument. Or use this as a first sentence and some version of that other one as the next sentence in the paper, or vice versa. Like I said, that's not there's throughout history, Americans have placed the founding fathers on an undeserved pedestal. It's not terrible except for the throughout history part, which kind of ruins it. But there are ways of reworking that. And you could combine it in some way with this. There's not the collective crucial distinction to be made between the concept of a memorial and that of a monument. And you'll notice something here that will be addressed on the next video commentary that I make. But this doesn't just say there is an often neglected but crucial distinction to be made. It's not saying that this distinction is neglected in every circumstance. There's been some talk about it already, and especially in the past few years, there's been talk about memorials and monuments, and especially what kind of things are worth memorializing, right? I mean, we see this with the Civil War monuments, especially. And one of the things that this hinges on, this question of, preserving history and so on and so forth, has to do, I think, with the distinction between a memorial and a monument. But at any rate, you know that you're opening up a discussion here, and you'd want to make it more precise, probably with something like that other sentence. But it's working towards a thesis. It's working towards a debatable point. We know that we already have some idea of the boundaries of the playing field here. All right, so here's a third one. This could replace this third one here. People everywhere have always enjoyed the benefits of nature. You might replace that with something like this. And you've heard me reference this article before. Like I said, all of these are in reference to things that I've assigned in past 1010 classes. So I've made reference to this article before, even though you haven't read it. This is a much stronger opening paragraph or opening sentence, and I've actually done two sentences here. But Cormac Cullinan's article, "If Nature Had Rights," makes a valid case that the American legal system is unfairly partial to corporations over nature, stating that in the eyes of American law today, most of the community of life on Earth remains mere property, natural resources to be exploited, bought, and sold just as slaves were. But although Cullinan soundly identifies the failures of the American legal system to include nature-like corporations in its democratic union, he never really explains why nature shouldn't be treated as mere property. All right, so I've cheated with this one a little bit by doing two sentences, but this is an example of how you might start off with a quote. There's different ways you can start off with a quote, but it's a good way to start, especially if the quote is if you're writing about a specific text, using a quote from that text can be a perfectly suitable way to start off. It gets us right into the conversation. So we don't entirely know what the argument that this paper is going to be making yet, but we know that it's somehow in reference to claims made in this article of Nature Had Rights and the broader issues that brings up. We know that it's talking about that, and we know that it's agreeing largely with what Cullinan wrote, but it's also departing. It's building a little bit on the ideas that he presented. So this isn't setting up a sheer summary, right? It's adding to the conversation. It's moving it forward. Not necessarily a disagreement. There might be a little bit of disagreement here, but it's not a direct opposition. But it's pointing out something that Cullinan left out. And there are ways that this might drive towards a direct opposition. Sometimes in order to reach an antithesis, you might start off at a slighter point of departure and work towards that. But we know what the conversation is here, rather than just a vague statement about nature all over the world throughout all of time and history. Right. So finally, this first sentence here, this fourth example that could be a good opener. Many of the people making the goods enjoyed regularly by the average American consumer are like lobsters boiled alive. Right, and again, so that could replace this sentence. Everyone knows that American corporations have always valued profit over people, but what happens when people see the pain caused by corporations to other people? But again, there are ways of reworking this to be something suitable and manageable to put towards the start of an argumentative essay. But the point of this sentence, so this was in reference to an article called "Consider the Lobster" by David Foster Wallace, and it's setting up an argument that pertains to that paper. So it's about a guy. This guy goes to a lobster festival, and he's offering up these ideas about American consumerism and how the lobster festival somehow represents certain tendencies in American consumerism. So using something like this, kind of setting up an analogy, a metaphor that relates to the reading, it suggests that it's going to be making connections to that reading and looking at things that text represents. That text doesn't talk a whole lot about the people making goods like in sweatshops and stuff. That's what I'd be driving towards here. That text doesn't really talk about that. There's a way to relate it to those broader issues in American consumerism, and something like this, it links it directly to the text, even though it doesn't say anything about consider the lobster in this text. It mentions lobsters as setting up its kind of metaphorical, analogical analysis that's prepared to apply this text to other issues that aren't directly stated in the text. But then you'd want to very soon get into mentioning David Foster Wallace and consider the lobster if that's what you were writing about. But this is provocative. It's not precise like a statistic is precise, something like this, but it's precise in that it's setting up it's setting up a rhetorical analogy. It's opening up a conversation. We know where we're going. We know that we're talking about American consumerism in this. We don't exactly know what's going to be said, but we know the playing field. We know what the game is, right? We know that we're not talking about, to draw back to my my analogy a few minutes ago, we're not talking about sports throughout all of American history. We're talking about basketball, right? So we're not talking about consumerism and the exploitation of workers throughout all of human history here. We're talking specifically about American consumerism and how that relates to exploitation of the workers. And as we'd soon find out if this essay were to go on, that we're looking at how the text Consider the Lobster somehow makes a commentary on this relationship between the American consumer and the exploitation of the worker. So there's a lot to be said about introduction paragraphs. There's a lot to be said about openers. We've barely scratched the surface, but these are some really important things to think about. And these are those since the dawn of time openers, anything like that. It's a very common issue with a lot of student writing and writing in general, like I said. So take these things to heart. Think about them as you work on your second paper, especially.